Welcome to Tariff and Trade Perspectives. I'm Kara Selby, a partner at PwC Canada. This is our first briefing on tariffs and trade between Canada and the US. Events are unfolding quickly, so be sure to consider what might have changed since we taped this episode. Joining me today is Philippe Perreault. Philippe, thanks for being here. We're still expecting the 25% tariff on steel and aluminum products. Can you help me understand what Canadian companies should be doing, what strategies they should be looking at?
Well, in the short term, it's going to be quite difficult for them to do a lot of things. If we look at steel, the US imports roughly 25% of their steel from Canada. In aluminum, that represents more like 75% of their imports are coming from Canada, and that represents 60% of their consumption of aluminum. So for both markets, Canada is really significant in its export to the US. In the short term, Canadian companies can look to divert some of their sales to other countries than the US, perhaps looking at doing swaps with other companies that are servicing clients, whether it's in Europe, Asia, other parts of the world, and have them sell their aluminum to the US, assuming they're not going to be facing tariffs. But in terms of structural changes, it takes quite a bit of time to put a new aluminum and steel smelter in place. We're looking at, in best case scenario, at a 4 to 6 year time window. So the impact of the tariff, the Trump administration looks to bring back manufacturing into the US. It will take a significant amount of time to get implemented and have the impact south.
So help me understand, Canadian companies might be impacted?
There's two angles. The primary aluminum and steel producers will export to the US. The US importer will have to pay the tariff. Assuming that the price can be passed on to consumers, there would be limited impact for the Canadian companies that produce that, sell that to the US. Now that steel and aluminum is transformed into the US in a number of goods and then comes back to Canada and other markets in terms of finished goods or components that go into a different number of finished goods such as aircraft, cars, applications, and even cans. So if we look at aluminum cans that we use for soft drinks, sparkling water, or beer, those cans come from typically aluminum smelted in Canada, transported by train to the US Midwest. And then there's large manufacturing facilities that take those large slabs of aluminum and transform them into cans, which are then shipped back to Canada. Those cans now will embed a tariff in the price of the cans that's been passed over from the aluminum that was exported to the US. So cost of a can that might be 20 cents will now be likely 25% more expensive an aluminum can. So that will impact consumers of those beverages, soft drinks, sparkling water, or beer.
So Philippe, why can't we go back to, the old days where we had glass bottles? Like, wouldn't that be more cost effective?
Well, there's still a few of those around, but going back is an operational challenge for the manufacturers of beer or soft drinks. So you need a different packaging system. So operationally, it would take a significant number of months to change the value chain and the production system to be able to do that.
It's sounding like that's not something that's going to happen in, say, a 30-day pause. It sounds like if you really wanted to change the way that you bottle your beer, that could be a longer than 4-year time frame.
It would be a significant investment decisions for the bottlers, maybe not in years, but certainly in a number of months. We could foresee also that we could seek to produce those cans in Canada. The challenge with doing that is these are very large plants that represents large investment. And the reason they are in the US is because of the scale of the production and demand in the US. So that allows to have that scale of production. And those plants have largely amortized capital, which in terms of production costs lowers the production cost versus implementing a new plant here in Canada would probably bring the cost of producing those cans, particularly if you don't consider the tariffs, to a much higher cost. We don't know how long those tariffs will be implemented and whether that plant would be cost-effective, competitive in the future.
What are the ripple effects on other industries from the steel tariffs?
We produce steel in Canada that is exported to the US as primary steel. Then it's transformed into different alloys that are going to be used to make parts for the auto industry. Those alloyed steel parts are then shipped back to Canada, now with that tariff, and are going to be transported into specific auto parts. produced in Canada, then shipped back into the US, and these goods can cross the border a few times. Now that steel will now be tariffed, so the cost of those parts will go up for the auto manufacturers, and thus we expect the cost of the cars, the American-produced cars, to go up quite a bit. So the impact of that is it will weaken the competitiveness of the auto industry, both in Canada and the US, and could put eventually the future of some of those companies at risk.
Philippe, how do we advise our clients to respond to this?
The first thing is to stay quite abreast of the situation because it's changing daily, as we all see. The second thing is really look at your business and look to model the potential impacts of those tariffs on your business, whether those prices can be passed through to the consumers, or whether if you're a buyer of goods that will be impacted by tariffs, how is that going to impact your cost competitiveness and supply chain? So once we've modeled those risks, what's important is to look at the risk mitigation options. What can you do in the short, medium term to mitigate the impact of those tariffs, your profitability, on your liquidity, and on your ability to meet your debt covenants as a company. And then you'd look to implement quick wins to mitigate cash spending as much as possible and to be able to prepare for more uncertainty over the next weeks.
Thank you, Philippe, for your great insights.
Thanks, Kara, for having me. It was great being here with you and discussing those important issues.
Thank you for joining us on our first episode of Tariff and Trade Perspectives.